Yes, good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the last panel of this afternoon and of this conference. My name is Joerg Hofmann. I'm from Germany, and I have the pleasure to welcome you to this hopefully very interesting and dynamic panel. It's the last panel of this event, as I said, and since this is the case, at this point, I like to thank Zoltan very much for the short-term and highly professional transformation of a terrestrial conference into a virtual conference. This has facilitated the international exchange of information and experience, and given the circumstances of these times, it shows a very high level of responsibility. So kudos, Zoltan, and thank you very much. Responsibility is also a very important benchmark in the central aspect of our topic, which is the advertising restrictions that are currently applying as a burden the industry. Successful regulation of gambling is based on responsibility. Operating games of chance as well, that requires responsibility. And this also applies to advertising for games of chance. Responsibility for the protection of players, for the protection of society, but also for the safe existence of the industry. What is the right measure to meet this responsibility? In the crisis, we can observe that the call for stricter regulation is getting louder. This applies both to the offerings and to the advertising for gambling, and it culminates in administrative bans and in sanctions. The crisis affects the players. It also affects the industry. Let's make an assessment of the present analysis and an analysis of the development and search for ways to overcome the crisis in order to make the future better again for all stakeholders. I'm happy to introduce to you my esteemed panelists now, and I would like to ask my panelists to briefly raise your arms when I call your name so that everyone can identify your face and be linked with you when you speak. So first of all, there's Joe Ewens, Managing Director at VIXIO GamblingCompliance in London. I do it in alphabetical order. Secondly, happy to welcome Gustaf Hoffstedt, who is Secretary General at BOS, the Swedish Trade Association for Online Gambling, from Sweden, of course. Then we have Liashenko, who is Chief Marketing Officer with Parimatch from Ukraine. We have Sören Meius, representing the Baltics, which is a great pleasure to me because this is a Baltic centralized conference, even if it's virtually done. You are advisor at the Ministry of Finance, and you look back to a long experience in drafting policies and laws for gambling and AML, which is very important for us to be considered today. And last but not least, it's Morten Ronde from Denmark, who is CEO at Nordic Gambling, which is a law firm based in various capitals in the Nordic jurisdictions. And he's also the CEO of the Danish Online Gambling Association, of course, from Denmark. Well, I think we won't waste any time. That's why I'd like to start the discussion right now. You remember the topic told us is asking, will advertising ban still be enforced after COVID-19? To answer this question, it's important to know what sort of bans are in place now and what might be different in the future. I'd like to start with Joe, because Joe has a very broad overview, since he is editor with GamblingCompliance, with VIXIO GamblingCompliance, on various jurisdictions. And Joe, maybe you can provide us with an overview on what's going on today, what has changed, and perhaps you can focus on those jurisdictions that you think are most representative to show things are different now.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much, Joerg. It's a pleasure to be here, but also transmitting to everyone. Yeah. So I mean, in almost every country in Europe, certainly, there's been some sort of enhanced regulatory pressure on advertising. Whether that just be in the form of warnings from regulators or government about for gambling operators to make sure they're advertising in a responsible way, or in a number of jurisdictions, real kind of restrictions coming in. So to pick some key examples, as you suggested, Joerg, I mean, the UK, as the largest or second largest European market, is obviously very key. There's been a lot of warnings from regulators and government, but no direct action. However, the UK industry itself has taken steps through the betting and gaming group to voluntarily restrict advertising on television and radio. That's come under a certain amount of criticism from campaigners and from some politicians, because they did not move to restrict online advertising in any way, which you can argue is in this modern day the more effective form of advertising, but maybe not. So that's the move that's been taken there. In Spain, there's been quite significant government action to ban all forms of bonuses in online casino, online gambling, which is obviously a really key marketing tool. And also pretty much all forms of email and social media marketing for online gambling for the duration, as long as the lockdown measures persist in Spain. They are allowed to do TV and radio advertising between 1 AM and 5 AM, which seemed a bit confusing to me. I can't quite work out how only advertising to people who are awake and want to gamble between 1 and 5 is in some way protecting people against vulnerable gambling. Usually one of the markers of harm is those who are gambling at strange, unsociable hours. But anyway, so those are some of the key restrictions. I'd say Italy is obviously already had an advertising ban in place, and there have been calls there to have that lifted, specifically from the Italian football clubs, but those have been pretty roundly rejected, and it doesn't seem very likely that anything will change. A couple of other interesting developments in relation to the crisis that don't directly affect advertising, but do have a significant impact. I'd say that, well, probably the key one is to think of outside of Europe is Malaysia, which is considering regulating online gambling for the first time, which would be a pretty significant development in the region. And in Europe, Finland has put in place, it already had spending limits for gambling, but those have been cut quite dramatically to about a quarter of what they were originally. So yeah, across the whole continent, there's a range of different measures in effect.
Thank you very much, Joe. Let's look at one specific case. Maybe Sören, if you could tell us about Estonia. What's the current situation for gambling advertising in the Baltic states, especially in Estonia? And is the current situation different from the situation before the outbreak of the virus? And if so, how? I think you need to enable your microphone. That's the button on the left bottom.
Yeah. Hello.
Excellent.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you. Welcome again.
Yes. Okay. Well, actually, I had a look at what's happening in Latvia and Lithuania at the moment, and I discovered that its situation is quite different in Estonia and in the other Baltic states. Well, looking at the framework of Estonian advertising ban or advertising restrictions, we have a so-called holistic approach, where there is the advertising of more addictive types of games is restricted. I'm talking about games of chance, of course, and less dangerous games are having more possibilities. Lotteries can also advertise on TV and radio, and the betting is in between of those, for example, and they can they don't have the possibility to advertise on TV, radio, but they have other means where they can, well, use. So, but one very vital difference between Estonia and other Baltic states is that we do allow sponsor announcements and exhibition of trademarks, and this, of course, is what has caused a lot of confusion and even sanctions in Latvia, for example, where if they had like sports competitions where they could have like visible trademarks of betting and online casinos during these competitions, they actually said that this is some sort of breach of law, and they actually punished these TV channels and etc. So during Corona, actually Latvia banned all gambling completely, including online gambling, and Lithuania banned all gambling advertisement, including online gambling. And in Estonia, we just have shut down the brick and mortar establishments, and that is all. We have no additional restrictions on advertising. And why is that? So I had a quick look what was the main reasons between these different approaches, and it seems that probably Estonian operators have been more cautious, and they have not tried to be more visible during the state of emergency, because state of emergency is meant to be something where government can quickly act or react on anything which they may see as harmful for the general public. So if I think that in these additional restrictions, it might be that the market has somehow left the impression that they are taking advantage of the situation, and that has provoked a counter measures from the government.
It's very interesting to see these differences in an area where you have the Baltic states next to each other. My question would be, do you think, if you evaluate the most recent weeks, have you made good experience? I think that's the right decision made.
Yeah, well, in Estonian case, we see that brick and mortar are shut down. We don't see any additional advertising, or they have not tried to take advantage in the situation. And from what I have investigated, that casinos have actually applied for help, state aid from the government, so they have like a support mechanism for different kind of companies, and casinos are one of the biggest who actually have had support for their to keep paying wages for the employers, for example. So I think it seems very it's working for everybody, as well. We are in this, everyone's, so everybody's in this together. So in Estonia, it seems to be working.
That's interesting, because your restrictions are well less restrictive than those compared to your neighboring states, and that could mean that you are happy with your industry, that the industry is kind of complying with rules that are not given by the government, but they are self-imposed. Could you confirm, or is it completely wrong what I assume?
Yeah, well, they have agreed on not. Well, they have, of course, discussed it between themselves, and they have not, agreed not to break the law. It's nothing that is like self-evident, but they have discussed these issues, and also they have, they have the opportunity to actually apply to the government to lift the bans, but they actually discussed it, but decided not to do it.
Right.
So because so they had the opportunity to actually we want to also to open as soon as for example like supermarkets, but they decided not to do it because it's just a matter of weeks, and it's better not to draw too much attention to yourself and maybe provoke some sort of counteraction.
I like that attitude. This turns me to Gustaf. I think the question that comes up is how much regulation, how much restriction do we need to protect players? Is there a risk of over-regulation? We see different examples in what Sören says about the Baltic states. And in Sweden, I think it's massive what you are experiencing now. Maybe you can comment on the Swedish situation, and then the question might be, is there any over-regulation where we are suffering from, which is not even protective for players and for the market, let alone the industry?
Well, thank you, Joerg. I think that any responsible taking customer protection measurement must start with channelization. I believe it was Joe that gave an example from the UK with voluntarily commitment from the industry shutting down TV and radio ads. And that is probably doable in a jurisdiction with 95% channelization, as I believe the UK has. Whereas in my country, we recently presented a report from independent consultancy firm Copenhagen Economics, a Danish consultancy firm. And we asked that consultancy firm to estimate the channelization in Sweden. One shall bear in mind that we have a governmental goal that says that Sweden shall have a channelization of approximately 90% to have a stable channelization. And the result from Copenhagen Economics was that the channelization in Sweden is way below that rate. In fact, in some gaming verticals, and the worst one is online casino, we have a channelization of approximately 75%. So every fourth Swedish krona is leaking out of the licensing system as it stands right now. And obviously, any kind of customer protection is impossible to impose when the punter has abandoned the licensing system. So we have to, as they have done in the UK, we also in Sweden has to start with the channelization. But unfortunately, we haven't. And we have a super trigger-happy minister that just recently suggested further measures, further restrictions towards the licensed operators in Sweden, the ones that already pay their tax, follow all sorts of bonus restrictions, etc., etc. And those suggested restrictions that, by the way, are suggested to be operative from the 1st of June, that's in, well, 3 weeks or so. I do not wish to work as a B2C or B2B company only with the technical challenge that those restrictions actually cause. The main restrictions are suggested to regard, well, to begin with, bonus limitation that no bonus offer shall be worth more than approximately 10 euro. And the other suggestion is a mandatory deposit limit of approximately 500 euro weekly, on a weekly basis. This may sound like a lot of money, 500 euro a week to some of us. I certainly gamble for less, but we do have some high volume punters out there without any kind of problematic behavior that of course then will, well, either they will jump between licensed operators. That would actually be the best option. But I fear that those punters, they prefer to stay at one or a couple of operators. And as a consequence of that, they will most likely abandon the licensing system. So what we already face without the additional measures that the government recently proposed, we already face a severe leakage out from the national licensing system. And what's even more troublesome is that the government and the minister in charge really doesn't seem to care that much about it. He talks a lot about customer protection, but when we remind him about the connection between customer protection and an acceptable level of channelization, in fact, the rate that the government itself suggested 2 years ago when Sweden was about to re-regulate its market, it really doesn't affect his advocacy. So that's how things stand at the moment. We work, of course, day and night to with the hope that the government will, at least to some extent, change those coming measures, because after all, they are a threat to the channelization, and anyone who threats the channelization also threats customer protection.
Right. I mean, of course, if you lose customers, if you lose players to the unregulated markets, you cannot protect them. I think that is for sure. I guess the assumption of restrictive advertising rules during the crisis is like people are more vulnerable. They're at home, they're bored, they're trying to do anything, something's kind of entertaining, plays new bets, play some casino games. And I think we need to distinguish between the content of advertising. If you imagine the regulator in the UK and in the Netherlands objecting sort of claims like this is virus-free or corona-free sort of games to distinguish from land-based casinos, it's a silly idea to provide that sort of advertising. And I fully understand that this is something that we need to change. But is it really the amount and the scope of advertising? What are your thoughts? I just ask everybody if you like to comment on this. What are the mistakes being made now in terms of restricting things, and what should be done in a better focus to protect players and industry and the future? Someone likes to take over, please.
Well, if I may just give a start to that, to an answer. I believe it is only too tempting for a politician to use the COVID-19 crisis to implement certain elements, certain measures that probably hurt the gambling market and probably hurt the possibility to offer customer protection. But in the vocabulary, the verbally, they actually receive applause from that, from an audience that is not too capable of understanding how the gambling market functions. What we see here in Sweden is that for every measure that is suggested from the government, everybody, not just the commercial gambling market, but also problem gambling institutions, psychologists, sports federations, media houses, all stakeholders are extremely critical. Whereas the woman or the man on the street that probably don't think too much about gambling regulatory issues, they applaud every such restriction, every prohibition. It really doesn't matter. The consequence of that restriction really doesn't matter. So I believe that, at least in my country, but probably elsewhere in Europe, and I can say this with some confidence since I am an ex-politician myself, is that it is always tempting to criticize the gambling industry, because you know every time that every suggestion will be applauded, no matter the consequences of that restriction.
Yeah, thank you, Gustaf. Do you all share, panelists, you all share this view, or is someone with a different opinion? Morten, please let us know.
No, I absolutely share Gustaf's view. I think it's quite a paradox, really, that in a situation where the whole commercial business is down on its knees and all shops are closed, that you try to put sticks in the wheel of a business who's actually succeeding. And I don't know of any online operators who've asked for help from the government for paying wages to those people who they could not afford to pay. So it's quite a paradox, and the only explanation, as I see, is that what I think Gustaf is alluding to is that our industry at the moment has such a bad perception in society that any reason could be used. Any argument could be used for beating on the online operators. So now it's Corona. It could have been anything else where the politicians would have said, "Oh yeah, but we also need to do something about the gambling industry." And we definitely see the risk is that some of these measures that have been taken, they tend to stick around. So while they were brought on the table in the name of the coronavirus, they are maybe not likely to be removed afterwards. I think that is a major risk.
That's a good point taken, Morten, and I will come back to it. But now, Ivan, I bet you will have some comments for us as well.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Joerg. Can you hear me well, right?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, I would say that first of all, let's just split betting and gambling, because betting is not feeling very well today. Obviously, we do not have enough events, and the basis of Parimatch business is sports betting. We shifting a bit to casino, as we have like entertainment products that are available all the time. But anyway, we have more audience for betting, so our acquisition just failed by 2-3 times. So that's a problem for the company. But most of all, we're not even anyone. We have some restrictions in some jurisdictions that we're now operating in, like ban on TV advertisement in any other time than nighttime. For example, in Russia, we can't use the faces or anthropomorphic characters for the advertisement. So that restrictions has been held for a long time. We do not struggling any other restrictions during the COVID-19 crisis, but nevertheless, we feel that the business, the market has regulated itself. I can't say I do not see the situation from the inside in Nordic countries or in the UK. Maybe some problem gambling may take place. Nevertheless, I have inside information from my friends on other markets in Eastern Europe, for example. They also had some fail in their volumes. They also had some fail in GGR. So I can't say that this business is booming in this crisis. So we're just struggling, maybe quite less than others, but nevertheless struggling. And the other side, I would just say, like Gustaf said, yeah, that when some regulation trying to over-regulate, all these players will go to the offshore operators, and everyone will lose taxes as state. The white operators, their GGRs, the country, the industry will lose after all.
Thank you, Ivan. Coming back to the difference being made between the sports betting operators and the casino operators. Is it an option for sports betting operators in times where it's hard to find events where punters can place bets on to look at casino customers, or what you think this advice is just short-term related and maybe has some risks as well?
Yeah, I really think it's short-term related because as we see in our operation, the customers are quite different for casino and for betting. And for example, in Eastern Europe, we have quite bad history about offline casinos, and the casino is still associated with that old casinos. So even for the white market, yeah, if sports betting is accepted quite good, at that time casino is just like something from the 90s, from the years of instability. So that's like the bad thing from that times, not like good. For example, we have such a situation on one of our markets. Our key competitor just rebuilt all their acquisition to the casino in the situation of COVID-19. And we now see that they just shifted from the betting operator to casino operator. And as I said, for example, in Ukraine, the people have much less positive feelings about casinos. So they maybe won something in short term, but in middle term and long term, of course, they will lose because we will be more associated as betting brand. Of course, we lost in April, but in June and July, we will just take that back.
Right. You may be excited to learn, if you haven't heard it already, that at least the German Bundesliga will continue as of end of May. So there's light at the end of the tunnel. Things are going to change even here in Germany, in other areas. There are less restrictions. Whether that is a good or a bad decision, nobody knows. People expect a second wave, maybe. None of us can say how long this situation will last. But we have to deal with this. And Morten, as someone who represents, I would say, the regulator side, when you drafted the Danish model regulation years ago, and the trade association side, the lawyer side, so pretty much linked to almost all parts and sectors of the industry. If we talk about crisis management, what does the industry need to do to cope with this situation, to survive that situation, and what do governments have to do to make the best out of it for the better sake of this whole part of all stakeholders in that industry and in that market, including players?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, Joerg. First, I would like to say that we are also expecting the Danish Prime Minister to allow for the Danish Super League to continue actually next week, I think. So we're hoping for it to be continuing soon. So things are in my country, as in yours, are starting to get back to normal. And I want to say that fortunately, no measures were taken in Denmark because of the coronavirus. And I think, and I hope, so in comparison with Sweden, I think it's because they maybe have a longer and better understanding, the politicians, of the regulated market. And I don't mean that as an offense, Gustaf, but there is a balance in Denmark that seems to have worked for a long time. It's a balance where you allow for licensing and operators to have attractive products while still restricting them as much as you can in a reasonable way. Also allowing for advertisements, again, under strict scrutiny and strict rules. And that's a balance that I think many operators would like other countries to seek. But it's unfortunately not the case, and it's also unfortunately the situation in my country that the politicians who adopted the regime, they seem to have forgotten that why they put it in place. They seem to have forgotten that half of the online market was black before 2012. So they are about to bring in restrictions that are so heavy that we will see our market leaking again if it comes through. And it's a perception problem, as I said before. I think the industry has been too late to respond to the increasing aggravation with gambling products, and especially gambling advertisements. So when you look at TV in Denmark, and I assume also in Sweden, you'd see so much marketing that you think this must be the biggest and must be the biggest industry in Denmark, which it is definitely not. So it's creating the impact, a false impact with the consumer, that this is such a large industry that it has to be regulated more. And I think we have been too late to enter into negotiations about how to mitigate this. There's a lot of things being done by operators at the moment, and I want to point to the pan-European code of conduct that was published the other day by EGBA as a very good step forward to some sort of uniformity amongst operators in creating a code of conduct, because you have to try to preempt what politicians might do when they look at gambling advertisement. So it's on one hand communicating and having a dialogue with stakeholders and making them understand that there is no better alternative out there. There is no market where there's no gambling addiction and best products and 100% channelization. You have to find a way to balance it all in, and then on the other hand, the industry has to ramp up its efforts into creating a sustainable business.
Morten, I'd like to get back a little bit to the question, which is our topic. So after COVID-19, will it be different again? Or Morten, as you said, is it very likely that regulation will stick with these jurisdictions? An interesting question that comes up to me is when I listened to Joe mentioning Spain earlier in this panel, we got the news that the Spanish regulator now has been replaced by someone else who is more a politician for some reason, maybe, and that is a signal to the industry. How important is the person of a regulator, the head of a regulatory body, when there will be decisions necessary to be made in the future about changes of regulation, and that applies to the operations as well as the advertisements for advertising and marketing for the industry. Do you think it makes a big difference if someone else succeeds someone with a different attitude, or is the body and the government so big that it really doesn't count? Do you have any experiences? Maybe Joe, from your broader perspective in various jurisdictions, other cases you remember?
Sure. I think in markets where the government is reasonably liberal on gambling, or has a kind of settled market that it doesn't feel the need to intervene on very significantly, then the head of the regulator is very influential. If we look at the UK as an example, there was a definite shift in tone when Sarah Harrison, the previous chief executive of the Gambling Commission, came in. That really began the era of big fines for gambling companies, a real crackdown on compliance. All of a sudden, operators were having regular compliance investigations. The number of forms and things like that they had to fill in went up. And the current chief executive, Neil MacArthur, has kind of more or less continued on that line, albeit with a bit of slightly more collaborative viewpoint. And I think we've seen that in other countries like Denmark, where during a period where there was generally a bit of a more permissive approach. Although what I will say is, when a government gets it into its mind that it's time to crack down on gambling, then it starts to become less and less relevant what the regulator thinks. I think Spain is a pretty good example of that. Juan Espinosa, who's just left apparently voluntarily to be replaced by the politician you mentioned, or someone with a political background anyway. He was a regular on the conference circuit. Many of you would have seen him speak before. You would have spoken to him at events around the world. He was always very collaborative. He seemed to take a fairly nuanced and measured approach, and that was very much the situation in Spain for a long time. But then, since we've had the new government come in, and while Juan was still in charge of the regulator, you saw these very significant advertising restrictions brought in by the government. Certainly much more than the DGOJ under Juan had recommended, and I think you see that in lots of cases. I think Gustaf will know Sweden is a similar example. Although he has some disagreements with the SGA, they tend to take a more measured line than the minister does. But ultimately, when the ministers get into his or her head that they're going to make a significant, they're going to institute a significant crackdown, it's really, there's not a lot the regulator can do to mitigate that, I don't think.
I think one aspect that all these regulators have in common who we know are quite familiar with this industry, quite knowledgeable, and have this sort of cross-border view, is that they talk to the industry and that they create this dialogue. The concerns with respect to Spain are now, and the hopes are that these concerns have no reason, that this may be different. I think everybody made good experiences for the sake of the whole stakeholders, including governments. If this sort of communication continues, I think in Spain, Gustaf, I think what you need as well is that someone listens to your solid arguments and that you discuss things, and that probably you will find common ground for best regulations. If it's just listening and again listening but not talking together, this may be an issue. And so far, I'd like to hear Morten as well on your perspective to the future. Your anticipation is that regulators love to stick with those restrictions that apply now, and it's hard to lift them. Do you think sort of a dialogue among the industry and regulators can lead to another direction, or is it simply an experience you made in the past that is like a statutory provision?
Joerg, or
yes, for you, Morten.
Okay. I want to say that I agree with Joe that in some jurisdictions it's no longer the regulator that is in control, and it also applies to my own jurisdiction. Doesn't mean that they're not in control, but it means that you don't hear them anymore suddenly, because they are not allowed to be not in alignment with the minister. So when you see that the regulator is a government controlled body, suddenly you'd see that they disappear from the picture. And while in Denmark I definitely discuss things with the regulator and we bring things forward, they are not sort of designing the line of policy, and that makes it difficult, because the regulator, of course, is where all the knowledge sits. So a regulator you can speak sort of common sense to and pragmatic views. Whereas if it sits with the minister or with MPs, it's much more difficult. It's much more about feelings. It's about finding what is troubling them, which is not necessarily rational, but you need to fix their problem, and that's a situation that I think we are facing right now, and there's a lot of work to be done going forward, because now when the Corona crisis is over, you'd suddenly see that all those advertisements that were gone, they are coming back, and I think that it will be a shock to people that they find out that we didn't really miss those advertisements. Now they're here again. Oh my God, they are annoying, and there will be an uproar in society where they'd say, well, let's do something about it. I definitely see that as a risk.
Would you suggest, or would you advise the industry to kind of self-imposed let's say intermediate restrictions and not go too far?
I'd advise the industry to go as far as possible, because if the alternative is an advertisement ban, then when you get there, it's really difficult to do any form of proper business.
From the perspective of the industry, Ivan, what's your take on this topic? What do you think?
We always in this industry have the option to say it's not us, it's just affiliates. So I think even when the full advertising ban will come, until they won't license the affiliates, everything will be well in some volumes or others. Anyway, it will be the problem for the big brands that are trying not to take some market share, but to build up that market. So we clearly understand that in digital, more or less, this ban won't apply like on TV or for out-of-home advertisement or others more traditional advertisement that are helping to build up the knowledge of the brand, to build up the market. So I think that it may hurt the big players, and I hope very much that we won't get back with such a advertising ban in lots of countries. But from the other side, I would say that we have to understand that advertising market as it is, it also depends on the money that were produced somewhere, yeah, and the other advertisement holders maybe won't have the money to buy that placements. So that's the other thing, that it may take some time to understand that they need the gambling industry to drive their money there, not to fail the other industries, the advertising industry.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to you in a minute, but before I do, Sören, I'd like to ask you from the inside of the government authority of a ministry, in a situation like this, pre-COVID, during and after, post-COVID, when there is a need to change things, to impose restrictions or not to impose restrictions, how does it work within your authority? Who's going to sit together? Who's going to suggest the measures that are appropriate, and who is making the final decision? How does it work? Will there be many people involved, or always the same? Or is it the regulator who serves as an expert?
Yeah, well, in Estonian case, again, it might be a bit different than in many other jurisdictions, because we don't have a separate regulator per se. We have a Minister of Finance who's responsible for the policy development, and then we have a supervisor who's actually, in Estonian case, Tax and Customs Board. So we don't have a separate dedicated structure. But what I want to comment is that, of course, restricting gambling is such a low-hanging fruit for the politicians that it is really, really hard for them even to keep their hands from it. But what is good is, of course, to talk to a regulator, to talk to those people who actually make or write the laws, and to find these kind of compromises. For example, I think I already mentioned, one issue is that the visibility of gambling operators might actually in these crisis times work against them. So it's not that just, it's really easy to go and advertise on TV, but if everybody sees it, it's not necessarily actually those people who are actually going to come and play. Those are also people who actually hate gambling and everything about it. So in Estonian case, we have restricted TV, but TV advertisements, but the operators have found other channels, and maybe they are more appropriate. We do allow, I already mentioned, we do allow sponsors announcements, which actually represents the operators in a good light. They sponsor events that are really meaningful for people. People love football. They want to see their games, and they see the logos on the shirts, and they don't have a conflict with this. But if they see this very, very aggressive type of advertising on TV, which I also have noticed in Swedish media and in Danish media, it sometimes it doesn't offer anything. It's just some sort of blur, and it does not really come in a good way. So the advertising itself has to be made in a positive way. So this is what I think in Estonian case has actually helped us to keep our regulations reasonable. And reason is something that we must take into account in these times. We are entering into economic recession, and it means that governments will lose their revenues anyway. Tax revenues will be cut basically anyway. So it is problematic. And if you at that time are very visible and very aggressively try to find back your market, it might be like shooting in your own foot. So yeah.
Thank you very much. There was one very interesting point when you focused on sponsorship money raised by the industry. I mean, there are some examples in history not too far from now. If you look back, for instance, to the Katrina storm in the hurricane in New Orleans and that area, I think it was in 2005. 1 year later, I think it was, or even the same year when there was this earthquake in northern Italy. It was the beginning of a U-turn in thinking about regulation in Mississippi area, Louisiana. The riverboat casinos were those who employed people and who raised the money and who could support the communities after that disaster to build it up again. The same, in my recollection, was with Italy when the first online regulations been drafted. Francesco Roda is one of the big names of this area. Would you think now, as an upside of that industry linked to that issues of the crisis, there is an opportunity for politicians to look positively at the revenues raised and generated by this industry, to use this money to compensate a lot of losses? If you look at all these expenses we have, and you don't know where this is going to end up. Any contribution is welcome. Whoever likes to touch on this, please.
I could say that one point on that, it's probably an unfortunate reality for the industry if it continues the way it is. But
like, say me, Gustaf, if you look at Sweden, would you think politicians think this way, or is it something which we get our taxes, and if it's more or less, who cares?
I definitely have an opinion, but I think Joe was about to say something. So, and I am the polite type of guy, so I would like.
Oh, can you hear me?
Right, Joe, you're happy to take over.
I'm sorry. Hopefully you can hear me. I was just going to say,
if Joe is still with us, because I can't see his photograph on his video on my screen. Do you see Joe? You do.
Okay.
Joe, you can listen. You hear me?
Yes. Get a bigger screen, Joerg.
I need to, yes, or a smaller.
Tell you what, Gustaf, you speak. I will leave and come back, and then maybe you.
So
okay, like thanks for the question, Joerg. Well, I believe that taxation shall be as boring as possibly possible. The more boring it is, the better it is, because after all, the money that the gambling industry contributes with, it contributes with extremely important thing in all the societies. And I believe that is exactly how things should work. I have also heard suggestions that perhaps one shall earmark the surplus from the gambling industry to gambling treatment or all sorts of positive aspects in society. But I do not believe that any of those institutions shall be dependent on money from the gambling industry. So I am a firm believer, and I certainly live in a high tax society, that it really doesn't matter whether you are a gambling company or you are a car producer or you run a bakery. The tax money that you pay to the state shall not be earmarked. It's up to the politicians to hopefully take wise decisions on how that tax income shall be used. If I just have 1 or 2 minutes left, I would also, it's kind of interesting to listen to my Danish colleague Morten, and when he complains about that the Danish memory is sort of evading after 8 years, that the Danes do not remember the reason why they implemented their re-regulation. it seems like after 18 months that the brains of Swedes are reacting more or less the same. that we after 18 months kind of have forgot the reason why we re-regulated. We had just in Denmark, as in Denmark, a channeling of less than 50% 1.5 years ago. And with the kind of measures that we now are suggesting, we are just going back to square one. And I guess one reason, and we've been talking about measures and measures and measures. One reason for that is probably media logics, that the media always ask for measures from politicians, whereas what we now can see and what I can understand from the Danish example is that the most responsible taking authorities and governments are in fact the ones that rely on the licensing system that they created. The licensing system was also created for crisis in society, and if it's one day when we are really in need of that the punters are within the licensing system, it's actually during a crisis, because what we see with most of the measures that are suggested today is that they actually are throwing away the punters from the licensing system. So the most responsible taking representative of the government or a gambling authority is probably the one who does not suggest any amendments.
Would this be a call for more advertising activities or for different advertising activities in terms of education and information, and tell people, if you want to gamble, this is where we are, the regulated market stakeholders?
Of course, and we haven't done enough as an industry, and nor has the state, at least in my jurisdiction. For example, we have a beautiful self-exclusion system, and when we ask people on the street if they are aware of this system, the answer is quite often that they are not. So there is more to do, and that is definitely something also for the government to think about, rather than imposing measures that scare away the punters from the licensed market.
Thank you, Gustaf. Very interesting point. Anybody likes to comment on this? We have another 2 minutes left, 2 or 3 minutes. And also to the audience, if you're out there, if you have any questions, please use the chat room functions and deliver it to us. Probably we anticipated every question. Yes, please.
I agree with what Gustaf says, and I don't think the solution here is more advertisement, because in my opinion, doesn't know if it translates, but those who are not visible, they are less in trouble than those who are. So I think the gambling sector has to be a bit less visible, and unfortunately, I think it means that there has to be less TV advertisements, because the TV advertisement is where you become very visible to a group of people who doesn't really want to see your commercials, whereas maybe social media or digital marketing is more directed to those who are actually interested in what you have to offer. So I think the best thing for the gambling industry to get off the agenda of politicians and become a bit less visible than they are today.
I think we're all thinking about that. Everybody needs to learn from the crisis to be better, to do better. This is a very interesting aspect you raised, Morten. Maybe that's one of those aspects that might be considered for the future. Just one point from Germany, we are in the middle of a process of changing our law. Next year, there's a new interstate treaty in place, allowing for online casino regulation in a certain way, with a lot of restrictions. Advertising will be regulated a bit more, let's say, restricted than expected. Sometimes in the explanatory notes, you read that it shouldn't be too attractive. I think we are making the same mistakes as other jurisdictions, to not to realize that if we want to keep the players within the protected environment, we need to be mindful. I think that is an excellent result of this discussion. I thank you very much for all your contributions. Thanks again to Zoltan for putting all these panels together. I had fun discussing this with you, and I hope the audience appreciated our discussions. If you have any questions left, you could also find our email addresses and speaker descriptions on the speaker's profile site. Feel free to send us whatever you like on comments or on questions. Stay safe, and I hope to see you very shortly in a land-based event. Bye-bye.